is Nayr Ibrahim. Nayr is Associate Professor of English Subject Pedagogy at Nord University in Norway. She has over 25 years of experience in English and bilingual education in Portugal, Paris, Cairo, Hong Kong, and now Norway. Her publications include Teaching Children How to Learn with Gail Ellis, and her research interests include early language learning, bi and multilingualism, multiple literacies, language and identity, learning to learn, children's literature, and children's rights. Take it away, Nayr.
Thank you, Helen, and thank you YLTSIG members for organizing this. It's really a pleasure to be part of this. I'm going to talk about multilingualism and educating teachers multilingually. So how can we support our teachers in order for them to be able to go into the classroom and help and educate children multilingually too. So I'm going to start looking at how we are looking at multilingualism. So not the fact that multilingualism exists and, well, is a fact, but the fact how we talk about it and how we view it. And we're going to start by looking at a couple of statistics. Now, I wonder if any of you can guess what any of these numbers actually stand for. I think there's one that might be quite easy. The big number in the top right-hand corner is obviously the number of languages that exist in the world. So between 6,000 and 7,000, that's quite a lot. But the others may be a little bit more difficult. So here they are for you. So multilingualism is actually everywhere we go, and if you look at some of these numbers, you can look. You can see from over 300 languages are actually spoken in schools in London by the children that go to schools in London. So this whole idea of one language only is really not a reality on the ground. Now that's London. We all know how multicultural and multilingual London is. But if you look at Oslo, okay, in the country that I'm living in at the moment, 40% of the children in primary schools also speak a first language other than Norwegian or Sami. And Europe, even though Europe is actually the continent in the world that has the least number of languages, it does actually have between 280 and 290 languages. Did you know that? But only 24 are actually considered official languages. Yet, look at our Europeans, and in the Eurobarometer, this was 2012, Europeans, like more than 50% of Europeans actually consider themselves to be bilingual, and 10% actually see themselves as speaking more than 3 languages. So that is a lot of bi and multilingual individuals in the world and in Europe. Is this a new world order? Well, probably, but probably not. I think the world has been multilingual since we started inventing languages. And yet here's another statistic, and this is from 2019 in Brussels with this was a study done in primary schools, and they actually surveyed 4,200 students. And they discovered that about half of those students actually spoke more than 1 language at home. So another wonderful statistic to support the fact that multilingualism is the norm. So is multilingualism a superpower? I'm glad to say that we have gone from the quotes on the slide, bilingualism can lead to a split personality and worse, schizophrenia, to thinking that bilingualism, to the infographic on the top right-hand corner, and believing that multilingualism and bilingualism is actually a superpower. Now, I think we are somewhere in the middle. Because I think these are 2 very opposite and very binary perspectives on language. Yes, bilingualism is a superpower, but it's not like we like to think that children actually pick up languages like a sponge soaks up water. It doesn't quite work like that, because learning languages is arduous. It's a long process. It doesn't just happen, and then there are all the little kryptonite stones along the way, just like Superman also had his little weak points. There are also issues that we need to take into account when we are talking about multiple languages. And I think one of these little stones of kryptonite, I would say, is the discourse that we have around multilingualism. So let's have a look at this discourse. This is an example of a newspaper article. This is the Telegraph. And if you look at the headline, it actually looks like positive. Children who speak English as a second language more likely to improve in primary school. And this was a survey that was done across the country. However, when you look inside and you read the article, one of the quotes is the following: "Some very bright children come to this country and are born to immigrants." Now, isn't that just a little bit patronizing? Really? Some bright children are actually born to immigrants? I mean, didn't we actually expect that? Do we think that children born to immigrants are not bright? And then if you look at the same kind of discourse, and this is from the USA, once again, very positive headline. Statewide test finds ELLs perform better than native English speakers. Great. So basically ELLs are the English language learners, so equivalent of the EAL students in the UK. And but this is a surprising finding, once again, that discourse around multilingualism, as if we didn't expect it, as if we didn't expect these children who speak multiple languages and who just don't happen to have English as a language at home, were actually capable of learning English. So I think the discourse is still very monolingual. The reason why we're surprised, and the reason why we are surprised that intelligent children are born to immigrants, is because we see language through the monolingual lens, and we see that as separation. So languages are separate. Now, we are still functioning within the monolingual bias, and this is another quote, another newspaper article, and this isn't so long ago. This is 2014 in Luxembourg, which is a country that has a multilingual policy. They are officially, and they present themselves as a multilingual country. Yet, in this particular kindergarten, 3- and 4-year-old children are being punished for speaking their mother tongue to each other and to the assistants, who also happen to speak Portuguese. So if children's languages aren't ignored, excluded, then children are punished for actually using their mother tongues. So even though this is the 21st century, we still have a problem with how we perceive and how we actually talk about multilinguals. And it can also be quite humorous. This one came up in a Facebook discussion around using the mother tongue or the L1 in the classroom. And obviously this is a teacher trying to find a strategy to encourage her children or her teens, I think they were, to speak English in the classroom. But I just wonder if using more multilingual strategies, or knowing about multilingual strategies in the classroom would be more effective than actually putting up a sign like this. But teachers, therefore, need to be trained. So that we can move from this focus on one language, or on creating a space that belongs where only one language is allowed to exist, like in these pictures, speak English, to creating a more inclusive multilingual space where we speak all languages. And I particularly like the fact that we speak Punjabi, Polish, Bulgarian, and even Cockney in this particular sign. So we're looking for inclusion, and we're looking for a view of multilingualism that is inclusive of all languages and not just language separation. So the monolingual bias, unfortunately, also sends the wrong message to children. It sends a message that languages exist in some kind of hierarchy. Now, let's look at these two quotes, and they are from a study that was conducted in London. The top quote, "Miss Who Needs the Languages of the Immigrants," is actually an 11-year-old girl who has Arabic as her language. her home language. Now, Arabic is an international language with millions of speakers and one of the official languages of the UN. And yet, she feels that you don't really need the language of immigrants in this particular context. The little Chinese boy, this is him turning to his mother when she comes and picks him up in school. Don't speak to me in Chinese because Chinese is stupid. Now, once again, this is the language with the most speakers in the world. So what kind of messages is our monolingual discourse actually giving our children? So we do need to be careful how we talk about children's languages. So the monolingual view of multilingualism is one where languages are separate, and it is interesting how these researchers over the years have come up with metaphors to describe the separation. Double monolingualism, it's parallel monolingualism, where languages don't actually come together. The two solitudes, a Cummings quote, or separate monolingualism. So the monolingual bias, therefore, the reason why we have this idea of language separation is actually because of how we connected languages to national and political spaces as we were developing the nation state in the last 200 years, in the last 2 centuries. And as you get a quote from Weinreich, and this was already in the 1940s, he was saying a language is just a dialect with an army and a navy. So basically, the languages that we have chosen to represent particular nation states are languages that were chosen to become the identity of that particular political space. And yet the reality is that when we use language, they don't exist in those separate spaces. If you think of languages such as Norwegian, Danish, and Swedish, they are comprehensible to the speakers of all these different languages. And yet they are separate languages because they belong to particular political spaces. Yet loads of languages in China are considered dialects because they belong to one particular space, and yet the speakers of those languages cannot understand each other, or those dialects. So can you see how our perceptions and our dialogue and our discourse around multilingualism turns it back into monolingualism? So we would like to start thinking of monolingualism as the illiteracy of the 21st century, an aberration or affliction of the powerful, the real linguistic deficiency, a figment of the imagination, a myth detached from reality, a waste of our biological linguistic potential. Because then we will be able to treat our multilingual children the way that they deserve to be treated. And it is true, that last quote, a waste of our biological linguistic potential, because what we're doing is literally and this is Cummings saying that we are creating these rather bizarre scenarios of schools that are actually transforming speakers of foreign languages into monolingual speakers. So we are literally educating our multilingual children we're educating multilingualism out of our children and just basically creating more monolingual speakers of the language that we impose on them. But children have language rights, and it is a fundamental right of children, actually everybody, us the teachers as well, to be able to access our language repertoire and to be able to use our language repertoire in the classroom, and therefore actually foreground that plurilingual identity, which contributes to socio-emotional well-being and recognizes children's voices, children's choices, children's agency in how they want to learn and which language they want to use to learn. So we need to first start by debunking those myths about multilingualism. Now, I've written 2 blogs about that, so I'm not going to spend too much time on that. But what I would like us to also do is to start looking at what multilingual communication actually looks like. And this is a wonderful quote from my Facebook page, actually, a friend of mine and his 3-year-old daughter, where she was, he wrote that she has a tutti-frutti mix, and the child said, "Papi, todo esto sei mine." So she's actually using 3 languages to communicate. She has constructed meaning out of the 3 languages, and she's actually created a perfectly grammatical sentence. So what is wrong with this? This is not wrong, actually. It is actually quite sophisticated language work going on here. I'm also going to give you an example from my own personal experience. And this was a conversation that I actually then jotted down because it actually reveals how multilingual families and individuals function. And this was us at a restaurant. We went, my parents came to visit us in France. We took them to a restaurant, and we had 4 languages being spoken at the table. And there was always one person who didn't understand one of the 4 languages. But everybody could understand 2 or 3 languages. So this is basically what we start. We're talking about my dad's meal. He chose roast veal, and he says in Portuguese, "A vitela assada está muito boa." And I turned to my husband, because we spoke in English as our home language. "My dad likes the vitela." I always code switch. "What do you think?" So my husband replies, "It's very good." Now he turns to my brother-in-law. Both my husband and my brother-in-law are Arabic speakers. And they say, "Oh, el vitelo helwa," he says. And my brother-in-law says, "Aywa, yes." So he then turns to my sister. They had French as their home language. And he says in French, "Tu veux goûter le veau, c'est très bon ici." So my sister then turns around to my mother. Now, we have always spoken Portuguese to our parents because we just happen to have Portuguese background. And she says, "Posso provar a vitela?" And then I turn to my son, and we always speak English to each other. "Karim, do you want some vitela?" But of course, my son also speaks Portuguese. And he turns around, Henry replies, "No, c'est bon, my steak frites fine," constantly switching between English and French as he did all the time. Now, the reason why I actually wrote this down is because the waitress was walking around the table looking rather puzzled, and eventually she got the courage to ask, "Você está a falar quantas línguas? So how many languages are you speaking?" Now, we were speaking 4 languages, and we were having a perfectly normal conversation. We were not necessarily translating, but the conversation was flowing between the different languages, between the different people, and we were actually just communicating about who wanted to try this veal or vitella. That's how multilingual communication functions. So by looking at language and individuals through the multilingual lens, we then realize that actually we have one linguistic repertoire, and then we pick and choose the features that we want for that particular communication context, and in order to communicate effectively. That's how multilinguals function. So I think what we actually need to start doing is realizing as well that multilingualism is actually messy. It's messy. It's fuzzy. And in more academic language, it's a complex, dynamic, and multidimensional phenomenon. Because it includes all of these factors. It includes the linguistic factor. So languages may have different sounds, different words, but perhaps structures may be very similar. It's the linguistic, where you actually learn your language. Are there languages going on? Do people code switch or translanguage all the time? What policies are there in place, and how do these policies actually impact on education? It was very interesting listening to Wendy and how policies in Africa are impacting on how children learn or don't learn language. And Harry was actually talking about this yesterday as well. What is your own personal and family linguistic context? How do you, what languages do you actually use at home? How do the fact that your parents speak their language to you create an effective link to your language, create an identity in that language? And then once you've gone through all of these hurdles, the brain, when it actually takes in language, it actually does do it quite well because it is primed to deal with language. However, we need to demonolingualize multilingualism, because multilingualism was there before we decided to turn it into some kind of monolingual ivory tower. Multilingualism came before monolingualism, and we have tried to monolingualize it. So how do we demonolingualize multilingualism? We have to see children as inherently multilingual and multilingualism as a lived experience. We also have to help the adults in the children's entourage to understand multilingualism. And this will therefore encourage people to respect and make visible children's multilingual identities in the classroom and in other social spaces. We have to respect, this will allow us to celebrate diversity, but we also need to proudly share our multilingual stories, our multilingual experiences, our multilingual trajectories, which I don't think is happening enough in classrooms, because these classrooms therefore need to be safe and sustainable multilingual educational spaces in order for children to be able to use their languages as multilinguals do normally. But let's not forget that multilingualism does not exclude monolingualism. It is inclusive of monolingualism, because we also switch from monolingual to bilingual to multilingual mode all the time. I'm in my monolingual mode at the moment, but if I was speaking to my son, I would probably switch to bilingual mode. So monolingualism is part of multilingualism. We also need to demonolingualize education and bring in strategies like multilanguaging, translanguaging, and a new term that I picked up quite recently, transknowledging. So multilanguaging is basically how you just use language very fluidly and normatively in your communication. Translanguaging, how you switch, how you bring in all your different linguistic. So when we talk about translanguaging, we don't talk about switching. We talk about bringing in the different linguistic, your different languages in order to maximize your communicative potential. Transknowledging is that when you actually switch, when you start using all your languages, you bring in the knowledge that these languages also contain and the knowledge that these languages create. Therefore, you are also bringing in your own cultural knowledge, and this also gives children power, and it makes them, and it gives them a special place in the education community, in the classroom community. It makes them knowledgeable about who they are and what they are and where they come from. So what I've actually done in my class with my pre-service and my in-service students, I've actually decided I'm going to use an English Plus policy, and I've told them about it. And this English Plus policy means that we are allowed to use our languages and bring our languages if need be and when needs be. And therefore, the idea is to create a multilingual learning space, creativity, and well-being. I think we forget about multilingual well-being. Multilingual well-being is about being positive about your own languages and children's languages, without excluding them, without commenting on them, without commenting on the fact that perhaps you don't have the right pronunciation, you don't have the right accent, you perhaps may have forgotten the S at the end of the third person singular. Multilingual well-being is about dealing with those things positively. So it all starts with bringing out talking about and making visible our multilingual repertoires. And these multilingual repertoires, I actually elicit these multilingual repertoires by saying, which languages do you know? I don't talk about which languages you speak, which languages you've learned, because it actually limits the amount of languages that people are willing to put into this exercise. So which languages do you know? And what the teachers do is bringing their mother tongues, all the other languages, plus those that perhaps they don't know so well. And that's where the dominant language constellation approach also comes in, which is actually very interesting. Because with the dominant or the DLCs, what you do is you look at your language repertoire and you decide which are the languages that you use the most, that you have most exposure to, that you perhaps have more fluency in. And if you look at these two examples, the bottom one is my DLC, which is Portuguese and English as my two bilingual languages, if you want. French way up there, because I learned French when I was in school, and then I've lived in France for 20 years. And then I've put in Spanish and Afrikaans. Now, not that I've ever learned Spanish, but being Portuguese, I can understand Spanish. And then I switched to Portuñol. I apologize to all my Spanish speakers in the conference, but that's all I can do with Spanish. But I can make myself understood, and I can function in Spain or in any Spanish-speaking country. And then Afrikaans is a language that was my second language when I was growing up in South Africa, yet it has, I must admit, French has now become my second language. Yet I have to keep Afrikaans in my DLC because of how the amount of time I spent learning it. And all the other languages as those that I've learned, I don't actually use anymore, and I know little bits and pieces of them. And Norwegian is my new language, the new language I'm learning, so you're never too old to learn a language. So once you actually start this conversation about teachers' multilingual repertoires and teachers' dominant language constellations, it's incredible how much more comes out of these conversations, and that's where the language silhouettes come in. Language silhouettes were used about 25 or 30 years ago by a teacher in Austria somewhere, and that was the language silhouette on the top left-hand corner. And now they have actually been used quite extensively since in research with multilingual individuals in order to give the multilingual children not only the possibility of making the languages visible, but also of connecting the languages to their identity. Because basically we asked children to, or individuals or adults, this has been done with adults too, to draw the languages on the silhouette in any part of the body. And the choice that individuals make about where they put their languages is very much connected to how they use them, to their identity in the languages, and their connections with their languages. So let's look at some examples. This is my language portrait. And remember what I said about multilingualism being messy? Well, my language portrait is very messy because I actually feel that the way I use my languages is quite messy. Now, I was asked to do this language portrait in Brussels at a meeting that we had around looking at looking at Europe's multilingual policies and the key competence for lifelong learning. And what is interesting about this one is that if you recognize the flags, I used flags, and flags are used quite often as representative of languages. But I use the South African flag, which sort of covers all my body because it's the English that I use on a regular basis. It's the English that I grew up with. It was my school language, it's my work language, it's my study language, it's my research language. Portuguese in my heart because of my mother tongue, and also because of connection with my mother and that emotional connection. And then I got France. I was living in France at the moment. France on my arms, which basically connects France to work. It was my work language. It's my work. I was working in France. And so I actually show my teachers my language silhouette, and we talk about what the languages actually mean to me. And this is an example of a language silhouette from a group of 14-year-olds, and one of the research I did in Paris with 14-year-olds, and I absolutely love how this child used so many metaphors to actually express her languages and her connection, her identity with her languages. If you read it, you will find, and it's also interesting that her silhouette is full of organs, the brain, the heart, the gut, and they represent different language identities and language connections. Like the brain, for example, is the first language that she learned, and it's the language that she uses on a daily basis to think, to write, to speak. Yet English is by her heart because it's her emotional and imaginative language. Arabic has a very special place in this child's life because, first of all, you've got Moroccan Arabic on the side, and she says she's put it on her right hand because it makes her feel safe and peaceful, just like her mom, who comes from Morocco. And then Arabic is also written or drawn at her feet because her grandparents are from Saudi Arabia, and she says it's her roots, it's what roots her in her world. Hebrew, a gut, because it's deep inside of her. German, I like the way she puts German on her in her hand because she says it's the hand that represents orders, and I was indeed forced to study German at school. And then the last one I'm going to focus on is Chinese, and she says just put it on her shoulder as a metaphor to say she's left it behind. So you can see how many metaphors this child used in this drawing in order to connect the languages to her identity and also to her family, to the people in her life, and to where and where the languages are used for her. I'd also like to just make a comment. A lot of these activities that I use with teachers are all very multimodal. They are visual, they are drawing, they are creative, because that is an excellent way of communicating feelings and emotions. So you're taking the language away and you're allowing your creativity to actually talk about your language identity. So and just a quick connection to what Joan was actually talking about yesterday, how important visual literacy is, and in this case, visual creativity. Language maps are another means of allowing individuals to talk about their language trajectory, so where their languages come from, how they actually developed their multilingualism, and it also links to different people and different places and different activities and experiences in this trajectory. So this is actually a map from one of the children, 14-year-old girl in my PhD, and she spoke English, French, and Japanese, and I basically asked her, write about your languages, but she decided to actually create a map instead. So she wrote, you've got the bubbles about English, French, and Japan, but she's put herself and her languages in the whole world. And what I really like is that there are no borders. This is a borderless world, so she belongs to the world. And then her writing is all about the people, her experiences as she was growing up in the UK, and her time spent in Japan, and then living in Paris and what that means for her. So these are her biography, her language biographies. This is another example. This time this is a 9-year-old who's actually drawn her language map, but in a kind of 3 strips, and her languages exist in these 3 horizontal spaces. Now, what happens a lot when you actually ask individuals to draw languages, they use stereotypes to actually refer to that particular language space, and you've got a couple of them on this drawing. The Persian carpet, for example, yes, of course, it's connected to Iran, but actually when you bring in oral and written narrative around these pictures, you learn so much more. The child actually mentioned that her mother's flat in Paris was covered in Persian carpets. So here you have the connection between Iran and France, and the fact that the child, this Persian carpet representative of Iran is much more than that. It's also representative of her mum's flat and her connection and her emotional connection to her mum. I also like the Eiffel Tower. Okay, yes, we all know that's from Paris. But if you look on the right, the way that the child has actually written the Eiffel Tour, can you see how she's meshed the 2 languages? So here you've got written translanguaging. And also, for some reason, this child was very attached to liberty, to the French motto of liberty and equality. Have you noticed how she's actually once again meshed égalité and equality and created equality to describe, and this becomes sort of a description, a representation of her multilingual identity. So these maps say so much. You can go so deeply into understanding children's representations, their connections, their emotional connections to the different languages. This is my language map, and this is basically how I present my language map when I start talking about myself. So once again, I think the important thing is that I'm using myself as a multilingual resource. When I work with my teachers, I tell them, so here we are, this is who I am multilingual, but I'm also exposing myself and my vulnerabilities. And let me just explain. I know the pictures look a little bit weird here, but never mind. The picture of the passport on the right is actually my South African passport, and the ID at the top is my Portuguese ID. So I am the daughter of immigrants, people who went to South Africa, and then I was born, and that's where I learned South African. But the interesting thing is, when I actually went to school, I was 5 going on 6. I didn't actually speak English because I always spoke Portuguese at home, and my parents always spoke Portuguese to me, and I thank them for that today. So what I'm actually exposing to my students is my non-nativeness in English, And that actually takes a lot of courage, because it took me a while to get to the point where I very comfortably do speak about being Portuguese and having Portuguese background, even though I'm an English language teacher and I'm an English language educator at a university in an English department. I think it's very important to represent yourself as a multilingual who didn't necessarily speak English at the beginning of her life as well. So when we have this discussion, we always end up with the very hungry caterpillar at the bottom left-hand corner, because that was the first book that I bought in Norwegian. So Den lille larven algebra, because that's what I am learning now in my old age. So language maps. Now, once I did this, the teachers themselves created their own language maps in the classroom. And this one was very interesting because she's got 4 languages. But before she actually added French, before she added the French flag, she hesitated and she asked me, should I put French on my language map? And I told her, well, I don't know, it's up to you. Why do you have French? Well, I learned French at school, she said. And I told her, well, okay, well, it's up to you. Do you know? I mean, do you still remember some words in French, etc.? And then she looks at me and she says, yes, okay. I'm going to put French on my language map. And that for me was a victory, because it means that that teacher has now embraced her full language repertoire, even though she only remembers a couple of words in French. And then she did something absolutely wonderful. If you look at the speech bubble on the right, she's translanguaging absolutely with all her languages. So let me try and read it. Ich hablo un peu de Deutsch und English, aber my language numero uno es el Noruego. And we had loads of fun reading her little speech bubble. So can you see how the teachers themselves are now actually feeling comfortable with all their languages? Now, I absolutely love this one because this is the same teacher. The map on the left is the one that she did quite hastily in the class with me when we were talking about multilingualism. And then she went back to school and she created her language map again. And that's the map on the right. And it's absolutely beautiful. Beautifully drawn with the different flags and little speech bubbles with all her little languages. Ich lerne Deutsch, je t'aime, bonjour. So she's got all her languages there, and you can see the journey. You can see the path and her language journey. Now she did this because what she did in school this year, when she actually came in, this was the beginning of school in August, September, she showed her students her language map. And she had her students draw their own language maps. And I was absolutely thrilled to see that she was actually reproducing the activities that we did in class with her own students. And this is what her students created. They are absolutely beautiful maps. And I like this one. I mean, I've got 2 examples of this one particularly because she keeps talking about the future. So languages exist now, but they always have they always have a role in her future. Like, for example, she talks about English. I wish to go to Oxford Brookes for my 2nd year of secondary school. Brilliant. And then she talks about Spanish. I am working on my Spanish every day and I wish to be fluent one day. And then she also wants to learn Greek and Italian in the future. So languages don't only exist now, they exist in these children's futures. This is another language map from the same activity, the same class, and the child once again draws her pathway, and you've got, I also like the fact that she's got loads of technology in here, all her devices, the laptop, phone, iPad, where she actually uses, where she's learning her languages. But at the bottom of the path, she writes, to be continued. So it's not actually the end of this child's journey. So languages is something that continues throughout your life. Language learning and language use. This is another interesting activity. It's more like a grid. And this is one that I discovered with François Grosjean. He was a researcher on multilingualism for many, many years. And basically what he did is he plotted his languages on this grid. And the plotting of these languages actually show how language proficiencies change depending on where you are, depending on how you use your languages, and depending on how you move from certain sociolinguistic space to another. For example, for François Grosjean, he's French, as you can see from the name. He was born in France to a French dad and an English mum. Now, up until the age of 7, he spoke French. That's language A. But then apparently something happened, and mum took François to the UK. And then he spent his schooling in the UK, and he went to a boarding school, apparently. Can you see how language B, English, is now at the top of the grid, because that's the language that he has the most daily use in, and also, therefore, the highest fluency. But then after schooling, François Grosjean came back to France, where he did his studies, his undergraduate and postgraduate studies. And then language A, French, came back up again, the language that is using the most. He then spent the next 20 to 30 years actually working in North America, the States, Canada, and can you see English is back up again, but most daily use and therefore higher fluency. Now he's retired, he's actually he's based in Switzerland, and he writes and lectures in both English and French. So both English and French are now languages that he uses on a daily basis. So can you see this language? This also allows us to see how languages do not remain. We do not necessarily always speak languages or use all our languages in the same degree, and therefore have fluency in the same languages. And even your mother tongues, in the plural, can change depending on where you are and where you're moving to. So that's important to understand multilingualism. So here's an example of how the teacher therefore becomes a multilingual resource. And this is one of my students who got her language map, her language repertoire, her language silhouette, and then the discourse or her narration, her narrative around her language silhouette. And you can see how, for example, she starts with the Norwegian, which is found in two places. She says first it's in the heart because it's where her emotions is, and next it's in the brain because it's her language of work. So these visual images integrated with the narrative actually create very powerful multilingual stories about someone who initially probably thought, I'm Norwegian, therefore that's the language that I speak. Objects are also very important in talking about multilingualism, and this is a little 5-year-old who this is actually a project we did at the British Council called My Languages Project quite a while back, and because I discovered that with our bilingual students, they were actually multilingual, these students. They weren't just English-French bilinguals. And I thought, let's discover what their languages are. Now, how many languages do they actually speak? And they got so excited about talking about their languages. And this little girl brought in her book in Gujarati that her mother used to read to her. So objects are once again, very strong, they make very strong connections to your language identity. Let's look at some other objects that I worked with. So this was actually in my PhD, and it was a Spanish, French, English-speaking boy who brought in these objects to represent his languages. Now, I wonder if you can guess which language these objects actually represent. He speaks English, French, and Spanish. I did spend some time trying to guess, and then I decided, well, let me ask him because I can't really see the connection. And when I asked him which language this object represented, he said English. Now that really surprised me. Why English? Well, because this little boy actually learned English in a kindergarten in an international school in Dubai. He spent 3 years in Dubai where he picked up English, and for him, English will forever be associated with the desert, with camels, with men in robes. For him, English is not the green moors of England because he's actually never lived in England. This is English for him. So isn't it interesting how our language repertoires now are not connected to particular language, linguistic, political, cultural spaces? We need to detach our languages, and English is very much in that situation. Detach our languages from these spaces because the language experiences we have today are not necessarily in the spaces where these languages were actually created and are actually used on a daily basis. And this is a wonderful example. Now, my objects are elephants. And this is what I present when I talk about objects, simply because if anybody knows me, I have about 130 elephants. I like elephants. What can I say? So evidently, these elephants have meaning for me. And the one that has a very special meaning is the one in the top right-hand corner. He's sort of an Asian elephant, but unfortunately the poor thing is losing all his beauty and his stones. However, the reason why it's such a special elephant, and I will always keep it, is because it was the first elephant that my son bought me. He went away on a school trip. He was 9 years old, and what did he bring back for Mum? An elephant, because he knew Mum liked elephants. So also these objects, and this is connected to our life in France, where we were speaking English and French. So these objects are all connected to the languages. So some of these elephants my mom gave me, so they can, even though they're not elephants or do not have a connection to the Portuguese context, they are actually connected to my experience of these languages. The ones in the middle, the fancy-wancy elephants, that's France. And in the top one, the one with lots of different colors and greens and yellows, that's very much my travels and the different languages I encounter. So these objects have connections to my stories and my languages. So ask teachers, ask children to bring in objects, and the stories they tell are absolutely fascinating. Literacy is part of multilingualism. We can't ignore the importance of literacy when we're talking about multiple languages. And this is an example of a school where children's languages were not just welcomed in the classroom, they were also used. And the children were basically learning their mother tongue as well as the other languages in this Irish context. And this is a school in Ireland. The head teacher, Deirdre Cohen, I mean, I really recommend you look her up, was decided that she had so many children, she was getting lots of children from immigrant backgrounds, and she decided just to open up the language space in her school to all languages. And what was really interesting is that the children were also part of these language spaces. They were part of the teaching of these languages. So, for example, they would bring in a song in Italian. Whatever languages were spoken in the classroom, the other children would also learn these languages. So if a child brought in a language song in Italian, all the children learned the Italian song. A poem in Hungarian, all the children learned the Hungarian poem. Fascinating language work going on here. And also, if you look at these three texts, the child has actually written the same text in the three languages. So this gives you a wonderful metalinguistic discussion of how the three languages are different, similar, etc. So here, and children are very capable of actually talking about their languages and very capable of bringing in metalinguistic comments about their languages. And this 9-year-old child, the Iranian actually that I've presented before, was actually telling me that Persian is a European and Indian language. So she's telling me that Persian is an Indo-European language. Very interesting. It's the same language, but not quite the same word. So she's really making connections between daughter and doktar, and mother and madar, and brother and baradar. And she's also then, in the next quote, commenting on how we actually write Farsi. Because we use the Arabic script, we don't actually use vowels. So this is a wonderful metalinguistic awareness of all her different languages and literacies going on here. Transknowledging, so once again, an example of transknowledging. And one of the things that we do in the classroom all the time is that. So when we actually, this is just an example of, I introduced a whole session on a view of a child with this particular text, with this image in French. I couldn't find it in any other language, so I introduced it in French. And I asked the teachers, right, any of you, those of you who've actually learned French, let's have a look at what's being said here. And by using the teacher's knowledge of some of the words, my knowledge of French, we came to a conclusion of what this said. And then the teachers told me that in Norwegian. On the side was, one of the teachers was actually describing English as having it up her sleeve. And she said it in Norwegian. So basically having something that is ready to go. She can just bring it out and use it anytime she needs it. That's what she meant by har noe I ermet, or having it up her sleeve. So we are both learning. I'm learning Norwegian from the teachers, and they are learning how to say certain things in French. So it's a two-way. Transknowledging is a two-way process. We're both learning from each other. Now, these are some of the teachers' responses to this English plus policy that I've introduced, or that the work that they're doing on multilingualism in the classroom. And the what I have learned list is actually quite interesting, because one of the comments the teachers make that I actually found really interesting is that what she's learned is a more nuanced picture of multilinguals and multilingualism. And that is so important, that multilingualism isn't black and white. It isn't one language versus multiple languages. It's much more complex. And remember, messy. The other teachers have been saying that, yes, she's very interested in her lessons, etc. And then she says also opening up for the use of multiple languages in the classroom. That's the one thing that she's finding interesting about being able to use these languages. And at the bottom, the teacher is saying that, yes, I would like to teach children not only the language, which is going beyond the language, but also about multilingualism, tolerance, and that everyone is equal, and that they have the right to speak up. So I'm really hoping that these teachers, I'm hoping that this is what they're going to take into the classroom. So, the power of teachers and educators. Now, I took this quote from Carol Reed's plenary yesterday, which I really enjoyed. So, parents have a key to children's well-being, but teachers have a spare one. I think that teachers with multilingual mindset have a whole bunch of keys that they can bring into the classroom. But these bunch of keys is not the usual normal old keys. They're big keys, they're small keys, they're badges, they swipe cards, because keys nowadays, very different keys open different doors today. So what the teachers need today is actually loads of strategies and ideas to take into the classroom and create this multilingual space. So teachers and educators, therefore, with these keys, they can understand multilingualism as a complex, multidimensional phenomenon, and the fact that multilingualism is messy and ambiguous. They need to explore their own multilingualism, and they need to find their own multilingual identity and their own multilingual voice in the classroom, and experience multilingualism themselves. And not be afraid to make the multilingualism visible, and therefore tell the children that some of their languages are not as well developed as they think. They need to work with languages they don't understand, but then they also need to use flexible multilingual strategies to be able to manage multilingualism in the classroom, and work with the families to encourage language maintenance and language learning. That's very important. So, how do we develop multilingual, so how do we demonolingualize multilingualism? How do we demonolingualize multilingual education? By developing a multilingual mindset. And this is done by making children's languages and plurilingual skills visible in the classroom, by including discussions around children's languages. Let's talk about my multilingualism, your multilingualism. Acknowledge the fact that children have multilingual repertoires, and that is actually a positive thing, and that children can contribute something positive to language learning through these multilingual repertoires. We need to develop children's awareness of their languages in the classroom, and we need to be we need to validate children's multilingual identity, explore all the different connections between languages, and teaching and using. We need to teach multilingual strategies such as language modes, translanguaging, metalinguistic and pragmatic awareness, learning, and help children to learn to be multilingual. So, with this, I would like to say that multilingual, it is being that superpower that we talked about at the beginning of the session. It's your multilingual voice. Once you have been given, once you take charge of your multilingual voice, then you have a superpower. And I would like us, and this child expresses this multilingual voice beautifully. Not only does she actually write I love you in her 5 different languages, she says that her languages are her confidence, her pride, her achievement, her difference from other, her power. But that power is all the more visible and important through a visual and drawing, through the visual, her drawing. And if you look at the bottom of her drawing, she's actually got the world in her hand. She's holding the world in her hands. That's the multilingual power that she's got. So, and with this multilingual voice, I would like to say thank you for being in the room. Thank you for listening to me, and thank you for this wonderful conference. So if there are any questions. I wasn't really looking at the comments as I was speaking, so I'm afraid if there were questions during the session, I wasn't really taking them in. But Voice, I'm glad your brain is buzzing. Wendy, absolutely. I think languages do make the brain buzz quite a lot. I hope you do use all my ideas, Chantal. Because they really are wonderful ideas, and the teachers of the children love working with them. I can guarantee you that. Yes, I think that's one thing that's missing a lot, is the fact that children are not made to feel proud of their languages and of their backgrounds, and that is a shame. That's us silencing children, and that is actually should be a crime, because, and it is, because children have rights to their languages. Oh yes, do send you my language map, Chantal. I would love to see it. Yes, transknowledging is actually a wonderful new term, and I would highly recommend you look up someone called Kathleen Hugh. She's a South African researcher, and I think she's actually the one who, I think, I'd need to look this up, but she's been using this term lately as a reminder to us that when we have mixed languages, when we communicate in multiple languages, we are also communicating in the knowledge that these languages bring to the communication. So very important. Yes, I think someone is mentioning empowering children. I think that is really important. And by allowing children to actually tell us about their own languages that we don't necessarily know how to speak, we are then empowering children, because we are allowing them to show us what they know and to share their knowledge. Where can you find these materials? The language maps are just, there aren't any materials as such. I just ask the teachers or the children, draw your language map. I use my own as an example. The language silhouettes, if you type in language silhouettes on the internet, I think you will get some, they will pop up. So I'm wondering with the brain for language maps, I don't think I've understood that. Yes, I think, yes, John Simpson does work quite a lot with languages in Africa. Wendy, yes, he's written a position paper about using the L1. Now, I don't like that term, to be honest, because I think the L1 doesn't describe what the whole language repertoire that children actually bring to the classroom, especially children in Africa, as they have so many languages. I mean, in Harry's plenary on Friday, he did actually bring that up, in that you ask these children, okay, what's your mother tongue? And they just look at you. Because they have so many. So I think, yeah, terminology, I think, is also important. So what are your languages? What languages do you know is probably a better question, and we'll then bring out all the different languages. Yes, Harry has about 4 or 5 languages. People in Africa always speak definitely more than 2 languages, and sometimes 6. It's actually quite incredible. Baie dankie! Andrew, ja, baie dankie. Jy praat Afrikaans. It's lovely to see Afrikaans on here. Yay, lekker. Yeah. Actually, I just wanted to remind everybody that we are going to have a really super pre-conference event in Manchester next year, where we are going to talk about multilingualism, and we have, yes, okay, I'm the opening plenary speaker.
Great. Thank you.
And we have wonderful lineup of speakers.
We've run out of
and
time,
the closing
I'm
plenary
afraid.
speaker is also another South African.
But I just wanted to say thank you.
So it's going to be a fascinating
again, like, you know, I love hearing you
see
speak.
a lot of you there.
I think everyone, I probably speak for everyone in the chat box,
okay, sorry.
you know, just your exploration of multilingualism and also like how we can de-monolingualize education. You know, and you made, a lot of really interesting points just at the start about how we talk about multilingualism, you know, and the idea that, you know, multilingualism is actually the norm, and you said that the idea of one language only doesn't really exist. Yeah, and I love the conversation about the vitella with your father. Yeah, just really, really wonderful. So thank you so much for your plenary. Thank you. Great, and now we're going to have a 5-minute break before the next session. So thank you, and see you then.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.